I want to understand a little bit more. What I think is really cool that you didn't touch on yet is that you're actually on the community board. And can you talk to me just before we even talk about cannabis related things, like how did you get involved and what does that entail?
I got involved with my community board, I guess, really like my son is 16 when he was 4, when my oldest son was 4. So over 10 years ago. Well, when I moved, I came back to New York after I lived in Dominican Republic. My parents actually moved back there and I went to Parsons. And when I moved back uptown, I wasn't even aware that the first community that my dad had immigrated to and moved into was Hamilton Heights. Like when he got off the plane in 1962, he had an aunt in the very community that I decided to move into. And that really, it hit me like I came back here without knowing, like I need to give back. Like I can't just be here. And I always gave back. I don't know. I blame it on my Catholic school upbringing. And my parents were also like that you always had to give back and volunteer and do things. So I always did art classes and volunteered, but I had never really gotten involved in politics, school government and stuff like that. But I never really cared to dive into politics. I was more into art and design. And when I moved into West Harlem, it was shocking because the disparity between, just 10, 25 blocks in Manhattan was jarring. And it was very, very clear that it was, in a community of color. It was like things just fell off the planet. And I remember it in the 70s and 80s. I grew up in Queens, so I know how New York was. I grew up in the city, but Manhattan was really something that, to see that level of inequity in such a small strip, like you just take Broadway and you just run straight down. Like now it's not so much, but think in the 90s, it was really early 90s. It was really bad in the 80s. And I just felt like if I'm up here, I have to do something. I have to be involved. There's a reason I came back here. I have to use my voice. I'm bilingual. I have to get involved. And I went to a town hall meeting at the time with Scott Stringer was the Manhattan Borough president. And I asked a question about the schools. I was just like, it's messed up. Like there's the disparity. And they said, well, if you feel that way, why don't you join the community board? And I was like, okay. So I looked it up and I joined the community board. And I never stopped. Like I got involved in the community board. I was, at that point, my son was in the schools. I was on the PTA. I ended up on the school leadership team. Bloomberg was the mayor at the time. He was really attacking the public schools, in particular in communities of color. The school I was in was getting co-located. So I got like, in a matter of 4 months, I had a really speed intro into city government and Bloomberg's particular form of city government. And I never stopped advocating. I ended up on the community board. I ended up on the Community Education Council. I was appointed by Scott Stringer. I ended up president of that because I realized policy was the government basically gives you the basics. It's like a template. They issue this template and it's the bare minimum. And the communities that have more wits about them, more know-how, more connections, they advocate and they change the policies to benefit them. But the communities where the people do not speak the language, do not have the savvy of engagement, they basically get the bare minimum and they don't know this. Like you have to stand up, you have to ask for more. And community boards, the city actually has, I think it's 59 of them, and people don't realize this. Every single zip code in the city has a community board, and this is it's a volunteer-based board. Nobody gets paid. It's you're not an elected official. You're actually an appointed official. So I'm an appointed elected. which an appointed official, meaning I actually get called honorary whatever in meetings. We follow parliamentary procedure. What we do is we are part of the city charter. And if you don't know what the city charter is, you should look it up, because that's the rule book of how the city is run. It's basically the job description of every city position, every city title, the process of everything. The process of how this city runs is the city charter. And part of the city charter is to have community boards, to bring some level of transparency and democracy and give the people a right in what happens in their community. A big part of what community boards manage and do is the land use and zoning process. This is so important in New York City. This is a real estate town. So think about the importance of land use and zoning. You know, it decides how tall the buildings are going to be in a community, if they're going to bulldoze the gentrification. All of this comes down to your community board. I'm in Community Board 9, which is West Harlem. It is parts of the Upper West Side, Manhattanville, and Hamilton Heights. So geographically, it's from 158th Street, from St. Nicholas to the river, all the way down to 110th Street, from St. Nicholas to the river. So we liaison as a community board, we liaison with all the city agencies, plus all the stakeholders in the community within that geographic zone. So think about that area. We have Columbia University, we have CUNY, we have St. Luke's Hospital, what else? We have Riverbank State Park. So all of these entities, the community board has committees that meets with them regularly, and annually, the mayor's budget, we actually submit district priorities into the mayor's budget. So I understand the mayor's budget, the process. I have to take trainings on all of this, on parliamentary procedure, on the zoning process, because we review land use applications. Like we are fighting right now in our particular district. So you have an idea of like the fights that we have to take on, because there's an opioid crisis in the country, and real estate is much cheaper in Harlem and northern Manhattan when the federal government and the state releases funds because they want to put more centers or want to help people. Well, all these methadone clinics want to start opening up in our district, literally next to a Head Start, next to, we have one methadone clinic that wants to open up next to a public library across the street from a Head Start, next to the Boys and Girls Club of Harlem. So it's like, we don't get paid to fight this, but we then work with community members, block associations, the electeds, we convey meetings, we hold press conferences for things like this. So you never know what's coming at you on a community board, but knowing that you manage the land use and zoning, every community board should be paying attention to cannabis legalization, because this totally plays into where are the dispensaries going. You know, the community boards are all, you know how you hear a lot of opposition in New York when they talk about homeless shelters and people show up and you have these, that's a lot of those people. Sometimes it's the community board. So when you hear organized people in communities, sometimes it's the community board. In our community, we've had a battle. We didn't have a battle, but we negotiated a $30 billion community benefits package agreement with Columbia University because they pulled eminent domain on a huge piece of land in Manhattanville. If you look at 125th Street and 12th Avenue right now, it's a completely brand new Columbia University, their business school, their art school, and a biotech campus from 125th to 134th. When they pulled eminent domain, the community board and the community, I mean, we fought for years, but we ended up negotiating $30 billion in benefits for the community, which is being given out to community-based organizations and, you know, based on a criteria, but you get an idea of the scope of what a community board can impact if they are organized.
Okay, so first of all, I got a DM that our Revel teammate Peter didn't even know you were representing for him, and so he told me to tell you thank you because he's in your area. Secondly, I want to talk about how the community boards and really advocacy groups in general are going to start to play a part with legalization, right? So let's talk about what has happened recently. So if people don't know, over the last 7 years, we have had a bill, the MRTA, which has more or less been the same with a couple of changes. Shout out to Chris Alexander. He's been a guest of the show. He really did a lot of legwork early on. But, you know, this came from Senator Liz Krueger, I'm sorry, and Assemblywoman Crystal Peoples-Stokes. Okay, so they've gone every year for the past 7 years trying to pass this through the budget. The CRTA came from Governor Cuomo, I want to say 3 years ago. This would be the third year, which is a different bill, similar objectives, but when it comes down to the details, you can see where they really start to diverge. Most people probably on this call, only because I know our audience and I know our panelists, would probably be advocates of the MRTA, and I would say you should be. So in the last 24 hours, we just got some information that the CRTA is no longer in the mix. They have reached a deal on the MRTA with a couple bills and additions. This has not passed, right? Saki's got his fingers crossed. This does not mean we're across the finish line. And even if it does pass, we have a lot of work to do. So first of all, I want to get your initial thoughts on the deal that we know has been reached so far. There's some speculation and there's some details that we can be pretty confident on. Saki, what is your just initial sentiment towards this information?
I'm cautiously optimistic. Besides going through the process of bill making in 3 different states, my home state of Massachusetts, California, and here in my new state of New York, it's not over till the fat lady sings. And I'm sorry, I know that is not an apropos statement, but until things get put into writing, signed, sealed, delivered, it's not ours. Additionally, there's always rollbacks that can happen. So for example, right now, our representatives have pushed really hard to keep criminal justice and social justice reform in the bill. However, on the back end, that means that law enforcement and prosecutors are looking to protect the ways that they've been able to prosecute with cannabis. So they're drafting a bill to counteract the criminal justice reforms. So again, advocacy groups, the work's not done. So just because this bill happens, legalization gets through, there's still work that continues to happen. Regulation now needs to happen. Systems now get it put into place. And again, we are all very lucky to have Miriam fighting for us, because there are very few people on community boards that have an understanding of the plant that she has. And those are the people who are going to make decisions about what dispensaries get open, what consumption spaces can happen, where they can happen, if they can happen. So, you know, we have to still remain very vigilant and engage people in their communities. But more than anything, we're going to have to re-educate ourselves and our communities so that we understand what this plant means and what legalization means.
All right, perfect. That's a perfect kind of intro here, because I'm going to bring it back to Miriam and the community boards. First, just a couple figures here. It's estimated that the New York market will reach $2.5 billion by year 4. Now, anybody that has spent any time in New York knows there's much more money flowing through the legacy markets today, right? And I think a personal thing of on the Revel, we want to make sure that the people that have been making money are able to make money. And so I'm very interested in seeing how this rolls out. Now, there's a handful of licenses that we can be pretty confident are going to be in this new deal based on the MRTA. So you can have a cultivation facility, you can have a processing facility. Processing would be to make products or, you know, vape pens or edibles, whatever. You can own both of those two licenses at the same time if you want. There will be retail, which is you know, dispensary, traditional dispensary. You probably cannot have a retail license and one of those other two licenses, but there's some exceptions that I'll get to. It looks like we're going to have consumption lounges, which I am extremely happy that we're pushed through. We can talk about that as well. I think there will be distribution licenses. So shout out to the people that make your product show up at your door when you ask for it. I think this is an excellent opportunity for some of our community. And then there will also be probably a kind of micro business craft license, which means you actually can be vertically integrated completely, grow, processing, and retail in one license, but you'll have some caps on the size that you can grow to, no pun intended. So first of all, I just want to ask you guys, what's up with the license where you can actually consume? Are you guys an advocate of that? If so, why?
The consumption lounge, absolutely, in New York City. And I tell you from a community board perspective, Community Board 9 passed a resolution supporting the legalization, and we included a lot of the MRT, the social justice measures, and let me tell you, it was a cat fight to get that resolution passed, and a lot of opposition and concern with the smoke in apartments. New York City is apartments. We also have NYCHA. We have, what's the plan? Right now, NYCHA is run federally, and if you consume marijuana, you lose your lease. So it's very complicated, and you cannot legalize in New York and not put into consideration, if you're talking equity and social justice, leave out NYCHA residents. It's just, you can't do that in New York. So consumption is absolutely necessary in New York, and where and how we do that also has to be done properly, because New York in a minute will put all those consumption lounges in high-end places, and they will become high-end and not available for the people who they were intended. So we have to be really vigilant that consumption lounges are actually for people who are challenged about consuming in their residence.
What are some other elements of this licensing that you guys like or do not like, especially from kind of a community perspective? Like, what are the types of things you want potential licensees to come to your community with?
I think medically, I'm still disappointed with the way medical licenses are set up. They're still very cost prohibitive for small businesses, which means that they're only going to be open for major cannabis corporations. That also leaves a space for it remaining cost prohibitive for patients. The other side of that is, in order for major registered organizations to bring the cost lower, that means they're going to have to be granted some kind of like, okay, well, can we have recreational at the same space that we have medical? We need to be able to, recover our costs. That then again makes a space for bigger business to have a nice stronghold on our New York industry, right? The other side of that means, look at what just happened last year with quarantine. Cannabis was declared an essential business. In Massachusetts, medical dispensaries were allowed to stay open, recreational were not. So that means that only big business will make money if, you know, heaven forbid, we have another quarantine or some kind of emergency. So I'm a little disappointed if that part still stays as it is, and I suspect that it will. As I said earlier, I'm cautiously optimistic that co-ops, micro-licensing, delivery, and consumption spaces, that those licenses still remain, because that gives an opportunity for New Yorkers and small business to thrive, quite honestly, right? However, unfortunately, those things can't thrive if, again, major corporations or major cannabis corporations, I'm gonna just call them what they are, major cannabis corporations are allowed to open before small businesses can get their feet under them.
Yeah,
And
I think
I want to echo that, because Community Board 12 had a forum, their economic development, and there were about 80 people there. And, you know, they need, it's not just licenses, they need training, they need grants, they need support. You know, everyone's focused on the licenses, but we need incubators, we need programs. You know, there's people who are experts on cannabis, but they're not experts on digital marketing, on SEO, on running a digital business, which let's be real, whatever kind of business you're going to run, it's going to be immersed in digital some way, somehow. So the community needs training on how to be entrepreneurs in this space.
And that takes,
they're asking for it.
And that takes time, you know, and I want to say that there are some people who are ready. There are some people who are ready to open their business, but they don't have the paperwork to do it, because maybe they are transitioning from a market where they don't have, you know, the proper pedigree, so to speak, to do this. So, you know, there's a couple of concerns when you talk about that. And then let's also talk about rural communities, rural New York, upstate New York. Like, we're all here in downstate, but upstate New York is facing some really tight financial restrictions up there. I went to college in Ithaca, New York, and that area, Binghamton, Ithaca, all of that, Elmira, it's prime for this industry. But do they have the capital to get up and running right now? And that's going to take time.
Yeah, so from what I understand, they say that they would like doors to be open for the first retail or adult use retail within a year. So, and they've also said for a year of the bill passing, and they've also said that medical ROs, the 10 licenses that are currently operating in the medical market, are now allowed to have 4 more dispensaries. They currently have 4 each. Now they can have an additional 4, so 8 total, as long as 2 are, I forget what the exact language is, but are in communities that are disproportionately harmed or something like that. Now, what that suggests to me with those 2 bits of information is that the ROs will probably be the suppliers of the first year's worth of product. So however the commission rolls out regulations, they'll probably try to get stores open that are selling product from the ROs. Now, people can debate whether that's the right way to go or not. I would actually take the perspective that is the best way to get up and running quickly. It does give them an advantage for sure. I don't want to see their dispensaries opening before other people's or prioritizing the best products. But that being said, another detail I want to share, that 40% of the tax revenues would go to public education. 20% will go back to drug treatment, prevention, and education. And then the remaining 40% will go to, will be reinvested to communities disproportionately affected by the war on drugs. So great things about the MRTA, right? The CRTA did not have our backs like this, but all of that to be said, it comes down to how the actual rules are written, right? Like, it's cool you say you want to invest in my community, But Miriam was already talking about, like, I don't want you to invest in a methadone clinic, right? I want to make sure that the people have a say in what's best for their communities. So I just say that to kind of give some people more information of what's coming. But when you see the rules being written, what are certain ways that we can advocate to make sure that those rules reflect the spirit of the MRTA and what, most of us in New York, at least in the Rebel family, are advocating for?
Wow, the rules. That's where then the city kind of takes over. And, you have to look at what's happening in politics right now. We're shifting a lot of city government is shifting right now. So we have to pay attention to what's happening in the city council, because they might make rules up for the city on cannabis. Yes, the state is going to pass the laws, but in terms of rules, what's the mayor thinking? He issued in 2018 some plan, but it's very pie in the sky. And what I've learned with policy, when you do not define it to the dollar, you leave it open for interpretation, and it's usually interpreted against you. Like if we state 40% is for public education, we need to define the programs, how much those programs would cost. Are they 6-month programs? Are they 3-month programs? Are we targeting, formerly incarcerated? Are we putting a chunk for women? Are we putting a chunk for mothers? I mean, we have to do the work now of defining everything. Remember, politicians are not the experts. They're just the presenters of our ideas. So now that this is all moving around and we know those percentages, we advocates should be breaking that down, what that looks like. This 20% drug treatment could be interpreted as, well, let's give them a methadone clinic. So you really have to pay attention, and community boards do play a big role in all of this, because they're the ones who are going to decide what is placed where. So people need to be hitting up community boards and challenging them. Like, what are you thinking about all this? What are you doing? What's the plan?
Miriam, tell me about that. Get super specific. How do I, as an entrepreneur that is sitting on this Revel webinar, actually go to my community and engage them because I want to start a business there?
So I saw someone's from the Bronx. Someone on the chat is from the Bronx. So you're from the Bronx. You know your zip code. Google your zip code, what community board you're in, find out what community board you're on. Right now, you got to take the lemon of quarantine and make a lemonade. Everything is on Zoom. You used to have to show up in person to these meetings, and they suck in person. But in Zoom, you can show up, and they're still trying to figure out how to run Zoom. So you get a lot of airtime. I'm telling you, take the lemon of Zoom and make a lemonade. Show up at your community board Zoom meetings right now. Google your zip code, what community board, just say it. Tell your phone, what zip code, what community board is my zip code? And it'll tell you. It has a phone number. There's a district manager. Go to their website. There's a calendar. It usually has a calendar of all the committee meetings. Pick a committee. There's an economic development. You're an entrepreneur. I'm like, shit, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm out of work. I hear they're about to legalize weed. I'm really passionate about this. There's a lot of empty retail spots in my neighborhood. What are you people thinking about this? Like, we could, are we putting dispensaries? Are we going to put businesses to support cannabis? Are you thinking of putting any kind of education center to help me get into this? Like, this is what you show up, and you put this shit on them to figure it out. I've had people show up at my community boards meetings complaining because their windows were changed and cats are falling out. So I have to go investigate all of this. Whatever you bring to them, the community board's job is to investigate it and figure it out, how it impacts the community. This is going to impact education. So Parents are gonna, guaranteed parents are gonna come out about this. Schools are, how are they gonna re-educate in high schools? The Department of Education better have a plan for high school students. As a parent, you're sitting in the Bronx. I heard they're gonna legalize cannabis. How is my son's school gonna talk about this? Because I support it. And don't be afraid to say, I support this. They need to hear that you support it.
And Miriam brought up education, and I want to tie that into what you were saying about entrepreneurs on here. There are a few things. One, I'm going to go back a little bit. There is a tool on Facebook called Town Hall. You can type Town Hall in, it'll bring you to Town Hall. You write in your address, it will list everybody from your community police precinct all the way to your federal government people. And you can reach out to them and they actually get this information. So that's a great tool if you're on Facebook, and you can start reaching out. But that means from police all the way to community board in New York City. What is it? SEC, SLC, that's the school community board.
The CEC, Community Education
CEC,
Councils.
Community
Yep.
Education Council, CEC.
You got to show up and start challenging them and saying, what are you doing? What are your thoughts? What's the plan?
And a
What's
lot of
the
times,
plan?
Yep. And a lot of times what'll happen is the head of that, the chairperson of that will write you back and set up a time to meet with them about that. So that's one thing. Another thing, a lot of times as businesses, especially in cannabis, we think about cultivation, we think about dispensaries, we think about processing and touching the plant. But here's something that's really vital: education. You can start developing plans to help educate, give public information about cannabis to schools, doctors, community centers. There's, one of the things I'm excited about consumption spaces is it's an opportune place to spread good education and information about the plant, the program, legalization, business opportunities, all kinds of things. We need to start thinking about ancillary businesses that do not touch the plant, right? So start thinking about, hey, I don't want to open a dispensary, but I'm great at HVAC installing systems. I need to start getting that out. Co-ops, starting your business, getting your LLC going. These are all things legalization's right here. And, we need to get our shit together.